The fire inside Ezra Calloway's stone cabin had been dead for 16 hours, yet when Benjamin Hargrove forced open the door on that February morning in 1849, warmth rolled out into the negative 22-degree wind like a living thing. Inside, Ezra sat calmly at his table, alive and comfortable, in a structure that should have been a frozen tomb. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of a forgotten mountain wisdom move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The winter of 1847 came to the Appalachian highlands with a cruelty that old-timers said they hadn't seen in 30 years. Ezra Calloway had lived in the mountains of western Virginia for 9 seasons, trapping and hunting, and he thought he understood cold. He had weathered hard winters before, survived snowstorms that buried his cabin to the eaves, endured weeks when temperatures never climbed above freezing. But the winter of 1847 was different. It didn't just test men, it killed them. Ezra shared his cabin with his younger brother Thomas, who had come west from North Carolina 2 years earlier, seeking the same freedom and independence that had drawn Ezra to the mountains. Thomas was 23 years old, strong and capable, learning the mountain ways quickly. The cabin they occupied was standard construction for the region and the era. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with clay and moss, a single room measuring 12 feet by 14 feet, one door, one window covered with oiled paper, and a simple stone fireplace built into one wall. It had taken them 5 days to build 3 years earlier. It kept out rain and provided shelter from wind. That had always been enough. The cold front arrived on January 9th. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours. By nightfall, it was below zero. By morning, it was negative 15. The wind came from the northwest, steady and relentless, finding every gap in the chinking, every imperfection in the construction. Inside the cabin, Ezra and Thomas kept the fire burning constantly. They burned through wood faster than Ezra had ever experienced. A cord of firewood that should have lasted 2 weeks was gone in 4 days. The problem wasn't just the cold outside. It was how quickly the cabin lost heat. Ezra could feel it happening. He would build up the fire until the interior was almost uncomfortably warm, then step outside for 10 minutes to retrieve more wood. When he returned, the warmth had already diminished noticeably. The thin log walls, just 6 to 8 inches thick, provided minimal insulation. Heat flowed through them and vanished into the frozen air outside almost as fast as the fire could generate it. They burned wood day and night. They took turns sleeping so someone could always tend the fire. They wore every piece of clothing they owned, even inside. And still, the cold crept in. Frost formed on the interior walls near the corners where the chinking had cracked. Their breath condensed and froze in the air. The water bucket froze solid, despite being kept near the fireplace. On January 16th, Thomas developed a cough. On January 18th, the cough worsened. On January 20th, Thomas could barely get out of his bedroll. Ezra kept the fire roaring, burned wood recklessly, tried to heat the cabin enough to help his brother recover. But the structure couldn't hold warmth. The harder Ezra worked to heat the space, the faster the heat escaped through the inadequate walls. Thomas Calloway died on January 22, 1847. The official cause, if there had been anyone to record such things, would have been pneumonia. But Ezra knew the truth. His brother had died because their cabin couldn't protect them from the cold. Ezra buried Thomas on a hillside above the cabin when the ground thawed enough to dig in late March. He marked the grave with stones and stood there for an hour, not praying exactly, but thinking. The winter had broken something in him, or maybe clarified something that had always been unclear. Men died in the mountains from accidents, from bears, from falls, from infections. Those deaths were random and unavoidable. But Thomas had died from cold inside a shelter that was supposed to protect him. That death was different. That death was preventable. Ezra returned to the cabin and looked at it with new eyes. He had built this structure with his own hands 3 years earlier, following the techniques every mountain man knew. The methods were traditional, passed down through generations of frontier builders. But traditional didn't mean adequate. For the first time, Ezra allowed himself to question whether the accepted way of building was actually the right way. He spent the next week studying the cabin's failures. He lit the fire and measured how long the interior stayed warm after the flames died. 3 hours. Maybe 4 if he built the fire unusually large. Then the temperature dropped rapidly. By 6 hours, frost formed on the walls. By 8 hours, everything was freezing again. He placed his hand on the interior log surface near the fire. The wood was barely warm. He went outside and placed his hand on the exterior surface of the same log. Cold. The wood was conducting heat from inside to outside almost as fast as the fire could generate it. Ezra began calculating, using methods that weren't sophisticated but were practical. He estimated how much firewood they had burned during the worst weeks of winter, approximately 1 cord every 4 days. That was roughly 90 cords per year if the entire year had been that cold. Even in normal winters, they burned 40 to 50 cords. The labor of cutting, hauling, and splitting that much wood was enormous. And despite that effort, the cabin had still failed to protect Thomas. The problem was obvious once Ezra focused on it. The walls were too thin, 6 to 8 inches of wood provided minimal barrier against temperature differential. When it was -20 outside and 70 inside, the 90-degree difference drove heat through those thin walls relentlessly. The fire had to work constantly to replace the heat that was continuously escaping. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. You could pour faster, but you couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Ezra considered building thicker log walls, but the mathematics didn't work. Logs large enough to create truly thick walls would be impossible to lift and position without machinery. Even if he could manage it, wood wasn't the right material. Wood was light, which meant it had low mass. Low mass meant it couldn't store heat. It could only block heat transfer, and it didn't even do that particularly well. What Ezra needed was a material that could hold heat, store it like a reservoir, and release it slowly over many hours. He needed thermal mass. He just didn't know that term yet. Spring came late to the highlands in 1848, but when it finally arrived, Ezra made the 3-day journey to a settlement called Timber Ridge to sell furs and purchase supplies. The settlement was hardly a town, just a trading post, a mill, and a handful of cabins clustered where 2 creeks converged. Ezra had visited twice before over the years, always briefly, conducting his business and returning to the mountains quickly. But this trip was different. He arrived with questions he couldn't answer alone. The mill was under construction when Ezra rode in. The old structure had burned the previous fall, and the owner was rebuilding with more permanent materials. Instead of wood, he was using stone for the foundation and lower walls. A mason was working when Ezra arrived, a German immigrant named Jacob Mueller, who had learned his trade in Bavaria before coming to America 5 years earlier. Ezra watched Mueller work for over an hour before approaching. The mason was setting stones for the foundation, selecting each piece carefully, fitting them together with minimal mortar, creating joints so tight that paper couldn't slide between them. What caught Ezra's attention wasn't the craftsmanship, though that was impressive. It was how the stones felt when he touched them. The day was warm, the first genuinely hot day of spring. The stones Mueller had set that morning, which had been in full sunlight for hours, were warm to the touch, not just surface warm, but deeply warm, radiating heat that Ezra could feel when he held his hand near them without touching. The stones were holding the sun's heat inside themselves. Mueller noticed Ezra's interest and took it as an opportunity to rest. They talked for 20 minutes, the mason explaining his work in accented English. Ezra asked about the stones, about why they felt warm. Mueller smiled at the question, clearly pleased to discuss his craft with someone genuinely curious. "Stone holds heat," Muller explained. "We call it thermal mass in the old country. Heavy materials, they absorb heat slowly but hold it long time. You heat stone all day with sun or fire, it stays warm through the night. My grandfather built houses in Bavaria with thick stone walls, interior walls 2 feet thick sometimes. You make fire in morning, stone walls warm all day. Fire goes out at night, walls still warm until next morning. Very efficient." Ezra felt something shift in his understanding. He asked more questions. How thick did walls need to be? What type of stone worked best? How long could stone hold heat? Muller answered patiently, explaining principles he had learned as an apprentice. Flat stones stacked horizontal worked better than round river stones. Thicker walls held more heat. Dense stone like limestone was superior to porous sandstone. A well-built stone structure could stay warm for 12 to 18 hours after the fire died, depending on wall thickness and outside temperature. Ezra left Timber Ridge 2 days later with his supplies and something more valuable than anything he could have purchased. He left with knowledge that would save his life. Ezra returned to the mountains in late April with a plan that would consume the next 6 months of his life. He spent the first week scouting locations for a new cabin, looking for specific features he had never considered important before. He needed a site near water, but he also needed proximity to stone. Not just any stone, but the right kind. Flat, layered stone that could be split and stacked. Dense limestone or sandstone that would hold heat efficiently. He found what he needed 3 miles from his old cabin on a ridge overlooking a creek. A limestone outcrop jutted from the hillside, weathered by centuries of rain and freeze-thaw cycles into natural layers. The stone split along horizontal planes, creating slabs that ranged from 2 to 6 inches thick. Ezra spent 2 days testing the stone, splitting samples, examining how they broke, checking for consistency. The limestone was dense and uniform, exactly what Muller had described as ideal. He cleared a building site 50 yards from the outcrop, on level ground with good drainage and sight lines. Then he began the labor that would define his summer. Quarrying stone. He had basic tools, a sledgehammer, iron wedges, a pry bar, and a 2-wheeled cart he had built specifically for hauling. The process was brutally simple and brutally hard. Find natural cracks in the limestone layers, drive wedges into the cracks, strike the wedges with the sledgehammer until the stone split, pry the split stone free, load it onto the cart, haul it to the building site, repeat. Ezra could quarry and transport approximately 15 to 20 stones per day, depending on size and difficulty. Each stone weighed between 30 and 80 pounds. He needed roughly 800 stones for the cabin he envisioned. The mathematics were discouraging. At 20 stones per day, he needed 40 days of quarrying. At 15 per day, nearly 60 days. And that was just to gather materials before any actual construction began. Other mountain men who passed through that summer thought Ezra had lost his mind. Benjamin Hargrove, who trapped the territory north of Ezra's claim, stopped by in June and found Ezra covered in limestone dust, splitting stone in the hot sun. Hargrove was a practical man, competent and experienced, and he didn't understand what he was seeing. "You building a fort?" Hargrove asked, examining the growing pile of limestone slabs. "A cabin," Ezra replied. "Out of stone? That'll take you till Christmas. Why not cut logs like a sensible man? 5 days and you'd have shelter." Ezra straightened, wiping sweat from his face. "Logs won't keep me alive through winter, like Thomas. Stone will." Hargrove shook his head. "Stone's cold. Everybody knows that. You'll freeze worse than in a log cabin. You're wasting your summer, Calloway." Other trappers expressed similar opinions throughout the summer. They saw Ezra's obsessive stone gathering as evidence of grief-driven madness, a man unable to accept his brother's death and channeling his sorrow into pointless labor. None of them understood what Ezra was building. None of them understood thermal mass. Ezra began construction in early August, with 840 stones stacked near his building site. He had no formal training in masonry, only the principles Jacob Mueller had shared and his own observations of how stone fit together. What he lacked in expertise, he compensated for with methodical attention to detail and an obsessive focus on creating thick walls that could store maximum heat. The foundation came first. He dug a trench 18 inches deep around the cabin's perimeter, 12 feet by 16 feet, and filled it with smaller stones packed tightly together. This prevented settling and created a level base. Then he began laying the first course of wall stones. Each stone was selected for its flatness on top and bottom surfaces. Ezra dry-fitted every stone before setting it permanently, ensuring tight joints with minimal gaps. The innovation that defined Ezra's construction was the double wall technique he developed through trial and error during the first week. Instead of building a single thickness wall, he created two parallel walls with a gap between them. The outer wall was built from his largest, flattest stones. The inner wall used slightly smaller stones. The gap between them, approximately 6 to 8 inches wide, he filled with rubble, small broken stone pieces, and clay mixed with sand. This created a wall system that was 18 to 24 inches thick depending on stone sizes. The outer wall provided weather protection and structural strength. The inner wall created a smooth interior surface. The rubble-filled core between them added mass and insulation while using materials that would otherwise be wasted. Ezra called it a shell, two stone skins with a dense core, and the name stuck in his mind as he worked. The construction was painfully slow. A single course of stones around the cabin's perimeter required careful fitting, leveling, and filling. Ezra averaged one complete course every 3 days. The walls needed to reach 7 feet high for adequate interior space. At 12 inches per course, that meant 7 courses. 21 days of wall construction at best, longer when accounting for mistakes, refitting, and the increasing difficulty of lifting heavy stones as the walls rose higher. Ezra used minimal mortar, just enough to fill small gaps and lock stones in position. Mueller had told him that dry-stacked stone, where each stone rested on the stones below through pure friction and weight, was stronger than heavily mortared walls. Mortar could crack and fail. Stone, resting on stone, would hold as long as the stones themselves remained intact. Ezra followed this principle, using mortar sparingly, relying on careful fitting and gravity to create structural integrity. By mid-September, the walls stood complete. The structure looked more like a small fortress than a cabin. The thick stone walls had no gaps, no visible weaknesses. Window openings, 2 of them, were small and positioned high. The door opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to pass through carrying firewood. Everything about the design prioritized heat retention over convenience. Ezra didn't need a comfortable cabin. He needed one that would keep him alive. The chimney was the most critical element of Ezra's design, and he knew it. A standard cabin chimney was built against an exterior wall, placed there for convenience and to keep smoke outside. But Ezra understood that an exterior chimney was a waste of heat. All the warmth radiating from hot stone disappeared into the outside air, heating nothing but empty space. He needed the chimney inside the cabin, positioned where every bit of radiated heat would warm the interior. He built the chimney in the cabin's center, offset slightly toward the back wall. The placement was calculated. Heat radiates in all directions from a hot surface. A chimney in the middle of the room would radiate heat 360 degrees, warming the entire space evenly. The position also allowed him to build sleeping platforms on both sides of the chimney, using the radiant heat for maximum comfort during cold nights. The chimney base measured 4 feet by 4 feet, massive by any standard. Ezra built it from his densest limestone, stones that rang like iron when struck with a hammer. Dense stone held more heat per cubic inch than porous stone. He had tested this during the summer, heating different stones in his campfire and timing how long they stayed warm. The denser limestone stayed warm 3 times longer than softer sandstone. The chimney rose 8 feet from floor to ceiling, then narrowed as it passed through the roof. The interior flue was 12 inches square, large enough for good draft, but not so large that heat escaped too quickly. Ezra built a smoke shelf into the design, a horizontal ledge halfway up the interior that prevented downdrafts and reflected heat back into the room. He had seen this feature in a proper fireplace in Timber Ridge and understood its efficiency. The firebox opening was wide and deep, designed to accept logs up to 3 feet long. Ezra built a heavy stone lintel above the opening and angled the back wall of the firebox forward, another heat-reflecting technique he had observed. The angled back wall directed heat out into the room rather than letting it rise straight up the chimney. Every detail served the same purpose: extract maximum heat from the fire and store it in stone mass. The physics were simple, though Ezra wouldn't have used that word. Stone heated slowly, absorbing thermal energy from the fire over hours. Once heated, the stone became a reservoir of warmth. As the room air cooled, heat flowed from the hot stone into the cooler air, maintaining temperature. The more stone mass, the more heat storage. The thicker the walls and chimney, the longer the heat would last. Ezra calculated based on his observations that if he burned a fire all day, heating the chimney and walls thoroughly, the stored heat should keep the cabin livable for 12 to 14 hours after the fire died. That was theory. Whether it would work in actual winter conditions was unknown. But the mathematics of thermal mass made sense, and Ezra trusted mathematics more than tradition. By late October, the chimney stood complete, integrated with the cabin structure, ready for its first fire. Ezra completed the roof in early November, using split oak shakes over a framework of poles, then moved his belongings into the stone cabin on November 12, 1848. The structure was crude by some standards. The floor was packed earth. The door was thick planks hung on iron hinges he had purchased in Timber Ridge. The windows were covered with oiled canvas stretched over wooden frames. But the walls were solid, the chimney drew perfectly, and the entire structure radiated a sense of permanence that his log cabin had never possessed. He lit the first fire on a cool evening when the temperature outside hovered near 30 degrees. The limestone chimney drew smoke efficiently from the start. Ezra fed the fire steadily for 6 hours, burning seasoned oak and watching the stone absorb heat. He placed his hand on the chimney surface periodically, feeling the temperature rise gradually. After 3 hours, the stone was warm. After 5 hours, it was hot enough that prolonged contact was uncomfortable. After 6 hours, the entire chimney mass radiated heat like a stove. The cabin interior reached a temperature Ezra estimated at 70 degrees based on how it felt compared to spring weather. More importantly, the warmth was even throughout the space. There were no cold corners, no drafts, no spots where frost might form. The thick stone walls trapped the heat inside, and the central chimney distributed it uniformly. At midnight, Ezra let the fire die. This was the test that mattered. He banked the coals lightly, but added no new wood. Within 30 minutes, the flames were gone. Only glowing embers remained. Within an hour, even the embers had faded to ash. The fire was completely dead. Ezra sat at his rough table with a candle and waited. He had brought a small thermometer from Timber Ridge, a luxury item that cost 2 weeks' worth of fur money, but having quantifiable data seemed important. At midnight, when the fire died, the interior temperature read 68 degrees. At 2 in the morning, it read 63 degrees. At 4 in the morning, 58 degrees. At 6 in the morning, when Ezra finally rebuilt the fire, the temperature had dropped to 52 degrees. 52 degrees. After 6 hours with no fire at all, on a night when the outside temperature had fallen to 28 degrees, the cabin interior remained comfortably above freezing. The stone walls and chimney had released their stored heat slowly, maintaining livable conditions through the entire night. Ezra had slept under a single blanket without discomfort. He had walked barefoot on the packed earth floor without cold shocking his feet. The cabin had worked exactly as he hoped. Over the next 3 weeks, Ezra conducted more tests. He measured how different fire intensities affected heat storage. He learned that a moderate fire burned for 8 to 10 hours heated the stone more effectively than a large fire burned for 4 hours. He discovered that letting the fire burn overnight, then die during the day while he was out checking trap lines, worked as well as the reverse schedule. The thermal mass didn't care when it was heated, only that it was heated thoroughly. The winter of 1849 arrived with deceptive mildness. December and January brought normal cold, temperatures in the teens and 20s, occasional snow, nothing unusual. Ezra's cabin performed flawlessly during these moderate conditions. He burned a fire each evening, let it die overnight, and woke to comfortable warmth still radiating from the stone. His firewood consumption was half what it had been in the log cabin. The stone shell was exceeding his expectations. Then February arrived with the same brutal character that had killed Thomas 2 years earlier. The cold front moved in on February 4th, dropping temperatures 15 degrees in 6 hours. By evening, it was 0. By morning, -12. The wind came hard from the northwest, sustained gusts that found every weakness in traditional construction, exploiting gaps and driving coal through thin walls with relentless efficiency. Ezra felt the temperature drop but remained unconcerned. He built his evening fire larger than usual, burning it hot for 10 hours instead of his normal 6. The stone chimney and walls absorbed the heat, storing it deep in their mass. When he let the fire die at midnight, the cabin interior was almost uncomfortably warm. He went to sleep confident in his design. By morning, the outside temperature had reached -18. Ezra rebuilt his fire and went out to check his nearest trapline. The cold was dangerous, the kind that could kill an unprepared man in hours. He stayed out only 90 minutes before returning. Inside the cabin, the temperature felt comfortable, perhaps in the low 60s. The stone was still releasing heat, absorbed 12 hours earlier. The cold intensified over the next week. On February 9th, the temperature dropped to -24, the coldest Ezra had experienced since the winter that killed Thomas. On February 11th, it reached -28. The wind never stopped, howling across the ridges, stripping heat from anything exposed. Other trappers and settlers in the region struggled desperately to survive. Samuel Pritchard lived 7 miles south with his wife and 2 children in a log cabin similar to the one Ezra had abandoned. The Pritchard family burned wood constantly during the cold snap, going through their winter supply at an alarming rate. On the night of February 10th, exhausted from days of constant fire tending, Samuel fell asleep while on watch. The fire died to coals, then to ash. By the time he woke 3 hours later, the interior temperature had dropped below freezing. His youngest child, a daughter of 4 years, had developed a dangerous chill. Samuel got the fire restarted, and the family survived. But the incident terrified him. He had come within hours of losing his daughter to the same cold that had taken so many others. Benjamin Hargrove, still trapping the territory north of Ezra, abandoned his cabin entirely during the worst cold. He packed essential supplies and retreated to Timber Ridge, accepting the loss of trapping income rather than risk freezing. He wasn't alone. Several other mountain men made similar decisions. The extreme cold simply exceeded what standard log construction could withstand while maintaining safety. Benjamin Hargrove returned to his trapline on February 16th when the temperature finally climbed above 0. The cold front had lasted 12 days, longer than anyone expected, and Hargrove had spent the last week in Timber Ridge wondering which of his fellow trappers had survived. He thought about Ezra Calloway particularly. That stone cabin had looked solid, but common knowledge said stone was cold. Hargrove worried that Ezra's obsessive construction project had resulted in a tomb rather than shelter. He decided to check on Ezra before returning to his own cabin. The detour added 4 miles to his journey, but Hargrove believed in looking after neighbors, even stubborn ones who built crazy stone fortresses. He reached Ezra's Ridge on the afternoon of February 17th. The temperature was 18 degrees, almost warm compared to the previous week. Hargrove approached the stone cabin with growing concern. No smoke rose from the chimney. The structure sat silent and still, surrounded by snowdrifts that had built against the walls during the windstorm. The windows showed no light. Everything about the scene suggested abandonment or worse. Hargrove called out. No response. He called again, louder. Still nothing. He approached the door and pounded on it with his fist. The thick planks absorbed the sound. He tried the handle and found it unlatched. He pushed the door open, expecting to find the interior frozen and Ezra dead. Instead, warmth rolled out into the cold air like water from a bucket. Hargrove actually stepped back, startled by the sensation. Inside, Ezra sat at his table, calmly working on repairing a beaver trap. He looked up when Hargrove entered, surprised but not alarmed. "Benjamin?" he said simply. "Didn't expect visitors." Hargrove stood in the doorway, confused. "Your chimney's not smoking. I thought you were dead." "Fire's been out since yesterday evening," Ezra replied. "About 16 hours now. Didn't need it during the day. I'll rebuild it tonight." Hargrove stepped fully inside and closed the door behind him. The interior was warm, genuinely warm, warmer than his own cabin had been with a fire roaring. He walked to the chimney and placed his hand on the stone. It was still hot, radiating heat steadily. He touched the wall, also warm. The entire structure was functioning like a massive stove with no fire burning at all. "This isn't possible," Hargrove said quietly. Ezra smiled slightly. "The stone holds heat. I told you that last summer. You said I was wasting my time." Hargrove walked around the cabin interior, touching the walls, feeling the warmth, trying to understand what he was experiencing. Outside, it was 18 degrees. The fire had been dead for 16 hours. Yet the cabin was comfortable enough that Ezra wore only a single wool shirt. The stone had stored enough heat to maintain livable temperature through an entire day and night without any fire at all. "How long will it stay warm?" Hargrove asked. "Until tonight, probably. Then I'll build another fire, heat everything up again, and repeat tomorrow." Benjamin Hargrove left Ezra's cabin that afternoon and told everyone he encountered about what he had witnessed. The story spread through the scattered mountain community with remarkable speed. A cabin that stayed warm for 16 hours with no fire. Stone walls that stored heat like a reservoir. A structure that had kept a man comfortable through the coldest weather in living memory, while others had nearly frozen despite burning wood constantly. Samuel Pritchard traveled to see Ezra's cabin in late March after the worst winter weather had passed. He brought his wife and children, wanting them to understand what had saved them from a fate similar to Thomas Calloway's. Ezra showed them the construction, explained the principles of thermal mass, demonstrated how the thick stone walls and central chimney worked together to store and radiate heat. Pritchard asked detailed questions about stone selection, wall thickness, and chimney placement. He was planning to build a new cabin that summer. Over the next 2 years, 4 more stone cabins appeared in the highlands surrounding Ezra's Ridge. Each builder adapted the technique to available materials and personal needs. But the core principles remained consistent. Thick walls built from flat stone, double wall construction with rubble-filled cores, central chimneys that radiated heat in all directions, minimal windows and doors to reduce heat loss. The trappers and settlers who built these structures called them rock shell cabins, using the term Ezra had coined, and the name spread throughout the Appalachian region. The advantages became obvious through repeated winters. Rock shell cabins required 60% less firewood than log structures. They maintained stable interior temperatures with minimal effort. They protected inhabitants during cold snaps that made standard cabins uninhabitable. They lasted decades without significant maintenance, while log cabins rotted and required constant repair. The initial construction time was longer, but the long-term benefits justified the investment. Not everyone adopted the technique. Some trappers remained skeptical. Others lacked the patience for stone construction. A few simply preferred traditional methods, regardless of practical advantages. But those who faced serious cold, who had lost family members or nearly died themselves, recognized the value of what Ezra had developed. They built accordingly. Ezra continued trapping until 1856, then transitioned to guiding settlers through the mountain passes as the region slowly opened to homesteading. He married in 1858 a widow from Timber Ridge who brought 2 children to the stone cabin that became their home. He lived a quiet life, rarely speaking about Thomas or the winter that had driven his innovation. When people asked about his cabin, he explained the principles simply and offered advice freely. Ezra Calloway died in 1876 at age 61, peacefully in his sleep during a mild autumn night. He was buried on the same hillside as Thomas, overlooking the creek where they had trapped together decades earlier. His stone cabin passed to his stepson, who lived there for another 30 years. The structure stood well into the 20th century, solid and intact, a testament to principles that transformed survival in one of America's harshest environments.